Hello, my name is Alex. I make things out of wood. I use what's handy, I use what's old, I use what's always worked. And you can too. So come, join the club. Here's a board I've salvaged. It's a piece of construction spruce. You see it has a groove on one edge. It was a piece of tongue and groove sheathing. I can't even remember where I salvaged this piece of wood. But if you find wood, don't let it go to waste. But now, I want a piece out of this board. Let's say I want a piece a foot long and say 4 inches wide. Where am I going to get that piece? If you look at this board I've salvaged, it's got a few defects. It's got some big knots. Missing a knot here. Yeah, see? But there are a couple of spots where I could get my piece of wood. Let's get a piece of wood right here. Just for the sake of argument, we'll say we'll measure a piece about 1 foot long. Now you can use anything you've got to do the measuring. I have an old boxwood rule. You could use a measuring tape. You could guesstimate. It doesn't matter. So there. Well, first we'll mark out, pick a spot between the knots. There's what we need. So we need to mark that. And then we need to mark the width of the piece we need. Once we have it marked out, well, then woodworking begins. Then we cut it out. We know what we want. We have a board, let's mark it out. So I'll put a pencil mark at the end of my rule. Another pencil mark at 12 inches, that's a foot. But I want this piece to be square, or reasonably square. So we're going to use a square to mark it. Now this is an old antique square, but they, old or new, they all work the same way. It has a stock that rides against the side of the piece. It has a blade. There's 12 inches. Now, you want a piece 4 inches wide. So hold the 4 on the edge of the board. Another pencil mark. 4 inches, another pencil mark. Then you can use a straight edge. And it could be a piece of wood, it could be anything. Lay it down on the 2 marks, and you can just draw a line. And then it's marked out. But, because we didn't want to cut this rough, we could actually do something else. You can use your fingers as a gauge. Hold your pencil at the end of the rule, 4 inches. Remarkably accurate. Surprising how handy that comes. Well, there's the piece we need. Now, how are we going to get that piece out of this board? Okay. Now, for the sake of clarity, I've just darkened these lines. Make it a little easier for you to see what's going on. So basically now we have the piece of wood we want that's part of a larger board. So we got to get this piece of wood out of this piece of wood. What we need to do that is a handsaw. Now handsaws can mean a whole lot of different things. Just take a peek here. We have various saws hanging up here for various uses. Over here I have a stack of traditional hand saws, and we'll take a look at some of those in a minute. I'm not going to assume that you have the full range of saws, and someday we might talk about those. But I bet any of you have or can easily get ordinary plastic handled handsaw available at any hardware store. Mine's getting a little long in the tooth. It's getting a little old, it's getting a little dull. But it's amazing how such a simple and inexpensive tool can do so much. So we're going to use this saw just for the sake of demonstration. I use it for particular purposes, but we'll use it just to show you how to go about getting our piece of wood out of this piece of wood. Okay. Now, something to keep in mind when you're cutting a board with a handsaw or any saw is there's two kinds of cuts necessary to get our piece of wood out of this piece of wood. When you look at a board, boards are long and relatively narrow. That's the way they come from a tree. We say the grain runs along the length of a board. So, when we cut this way, we're cutting across the grain. We cut along that line, we're cutting with the grain. When we cut with the grain, it's ripping. Across the grain is cross-cutting. Our hardware store can do both. But it's also, when you have the luxury, you can have saws that are dedicated for cutting across or for cutting along the grain. Okay. Going over here to my little low bench, and we'll start making a cut. Simply hold the wood down on the bench. Use one knee to hold it down, just the weight of the body. Put your handsaw on the edge, on the line, draw it back. Do that a couple of times. That just creates a little flat spot in the edge of the wood so the teeth don't grab too deeply. Now just use nice easy strokes. You're not in a race, okay? So don't do the jackrabbit thing with your arm flying fast. Just saw deliberately. This is the cross-cut saw. That didn't hurt a bit, did it? It only took a moment with an old, dull saw. So we've made the two cross cuts across the grain of the wood. That was quick, easy work. We still got one more cut. How are we going to do that? Same way. Let the end of the board extend over your bench. Again, just kneel on it. Hold it down. Start the cut. It actually cuts pretty easily. And you can saw all the way down, just keep moving your board ahead. Now, If you have the luxury of having a dedicated rip saw, well, then you're well on your way. So I'm going to show you another way of making this cut. One that's easier on me because I don't have to bend over and my back's not the best, so I've got to be careful. So I'm going to show you another way of making that rip cut. Okay. So I'm going to take this board and clamp it on top of my workbench and saw it up here. But to do this, I'm not going to use the saw, as I said. I'm going to use this saw. This saw is made for ripping, for cutting along the grain. If you compare the teeth of these saws, the rip saw teeth are large, very sharply angled. The teeth of the combination saw are quite small. This one has one use, and one use only, and that's to cut along the grain. So I'll set this saw aside. Now, I'm going to clamp this on my workbench using good old-fashioned bench hooks. All you got to do is make sure it hangs over the edge of the bench far enough so that when you make the cut, you don't cut into your bench or your 2x4 or 2x6, whatever you have to fasten it down. If you don't have clamps or tools to hold it down, you could nail or screw this board into a piece of rough lumber and then saw it off. But I'm going to use these little gizmos because they're so quick. There. It's not going anywhere. Now, when I was sawing this piece of wood on top of a low bench, bend over, I was sawing it in such a way that the teeth of the saw were pointing toward me. That's the way we mostly use saws. But in this case, I'm going to take my big rip saw, I'm going to reverse it so the teeth are away from me. I'm going to reverse the saw. And the saw will be almost, but not quite, straight up and down. Job done. There's what's left. There's our board. That's our first project together. You can cut this board. There's no end to what you can do.